The Dingonek is a rather peculiar beast, even in the context of this series. Its conception is surrounded by all manner of misinterpretations and confusions, born of exaggeration and ignorance, with a modern image smacked on top that seems to have added features out of nowhere. Yes, even though I scoured the internet as much as I could, I wasn't able to find a source that distorted the original image to the one that is perpetuated by numerous contemporary beast theories. Since there is little context I can provide to the incorrect version that seems to be so prominent, let me describe it first, then juxtapose it to the correct misinterpretation of a real animal. Yeah, we are going to jump through some hoops to accurately represent this beast. Anyway, the Dingonek is, as presented by numerous 21st century sources, a roughly 12 feet long monster, or a little over 3.5 meters, with a squarish head, often likened to that of a large feline. It has canines resembling sabers, as well as a single long horn. The body is covered in pangolin scales, the coloring of which is mottled, not unlike the fur of a leopard. The most dangerous part of the animal is the venomous stinger at the tip of its tail. To give some credence to the fact of how popular this version is, just take a look at the images I found. However, the real tales of the beast tell a rather different story. The first and most notable account of the Dingonek comes from John Alfred Jordan, a big game hunter operating mostly in Africa. His stories were primarily recorded by Edgar Beecher Bronson in his 1910 memoir titled Enclosed Territory, but some other retellings also exist. Either way, Bronson did a fine job of preserving most, if not all, of Jordan's experiences with the beast in an unaltered format. Jordan recounts the fateful day in relative detail, noting that it happened by Lake Victoria, where the Bourree River meets it. Unfortunately though, I don't think there is a river by that name, at least not currently. There is a river called Magago though, so it might be a misspelling or an outdated name. Whatever the case, there are more reports around Lake Victoria, so we can take it as the general habitat. Jordan mentions that the Dingonek name is one given to the monster by the Lumva people, two of whom were part of his hunting party. Mattia and Mosoni were the ones who spotted the beast first, and notified Jordan of the bounder, as he called it. They described it as a cross between a sea serpent, a leopard, and a whale, the last one probably signifying the size. Fortunately for us, the hunter responded with a healthy bit of skepticism and told them he won't believe it until they show the monster to him. Presumably the same individual was once again observed by the two men as it swam up the river, and Jordan was immediately notified. He hurried to the Bourree, or Magago, and managed to get a good look at the Dingonek, allowing him to provide a somewhat comprehensive account for Bronson's book. The creature was 14 to 15 feet long, which is around 4 to 4.5 meters. The sizable monster's head was as big as a lioness's, but resembled that of a leopard both in shape and coloration. Two long and wide canines were sticking out of the upper jaw, not unlike those of a walrus. In fact, some of the more dubious sources claim that one of its names is Jungle Walrus, but it was never officially called that to my knowledge. The hunter did note, however, that they seemed long enough to go straight through a man. As for the rest of the body, Jordan declared that its back was broad as a hippo, but covered in scales resembling an armadillo's shell. The shape was capped off with a long tail fin that calmly swished from side to side to maintain the beast's slow ascent upstream. The leopard pattern covered the whole body from snout to fin. Unfortunately, Jordan did not see the legs of the creature during his encounter, but he did find tracks. Apparently, the beast left clawed reptilian imprints the size of a hippo's feet. However, the account does not end here. Since we are talking about a story involving a big game hunter, you can probably guess that a gun was fired at some point. Indeed, Jordan realized that the Dingonek may at any point turn back and notice him. Fearing for his life, he shot the creature behind his leopard ear with a .303 rifle. Now, I'm not an expert on guns, but I looked up that .303 ammunition is generally used for medium-sized game. Even though we are talking about something a fair bit larger than, say, a white-tailed deer, getting shot at the back of the skull is going to be lethal. Well, according to Jordan, the bullet hit the target, but the beast simply jumped out of the water and thrashed about. He theorized the Dingonek used its tail to spring itself upwards, but was way too terrified to stay and observe.
Why are you running?
By the time he had the courage to climb out of the bush he cowered under, the monster was nowhere to be seen. They searched the area for 2 whole days, but the carcass was never found. Jordan said the animal must have survived the hit, but it would be surprising if he admitted to missing. While the monster was never found or encountered ever again by Jordan, Mathieu, one of the natives who continued to accompany him on hunts, did claim to see 2 more since then. Now Jordan's story is more than likely true to an extent. He did see a big thing, and probably also missed his only shots, both literally and figuratively. Bronson took the time to speak with the 2 Lumpa accompanying Jordan and got rather similar stories out of them. Naturally, this is not necessarily proof of it being true, but I'm inclined to believe them, despite being the overly skeptic bastard that I am. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll discuss the truth behind the myth once I've provided every notable account. Bronson took the extra mile to also interrogate others, trying to gather as much information about the Dingonek as he could. Talking with James Martin, who was an ex-collector at the time, he uncovered that natives did, at long intervals, see a large water serpent or reptilian creature appearing at the northern part of the lake. They revered it, as the creature was regarded as a harbinger of plentiful crops and growing herds. This grants more credence to Jordan's claims that the monster was known by the locals. For the sake of thoroughness, I must disclose that Bronson spoke with one Senior Deputy Commissioner C.W. Hobley CMG, quite a mouthful, who taught him about the Lukwata. However, that beast bears a drastically different appearance, more serpentine and catfish-like, with no actual link to the Dingonek, save for the habitat. The 2 mentioned together did cause some later sources to tackle the beasts in tandem, but the idea of them being a single creature is always dropped rather swiftly. Alright, let's see if there's anything more of interest in the A Hideous Old Haunter chapter. Kindness the African native mistakes for fear of him. Oh, gratitude he is innocent of. Flog one soundly for his derelictions and you have an industrious, cheerfully obedient servant. For fuck's sake. Seriously, I only read like half of a chapter. Let's just close this one. For the next source, we move on to an article written by Charles William Hobley. Yes, that's C.W. Hobley. He discussed multiple unidentified beasts in the 1913 Journal of East Africa Uganda Natural History Society, and Dingonek was among them. Now, since he was the original person who confused the monster with the Lukwata on the basis that both were said to be reptilian, it is not clear whether some of the accounts belong to the former or the latter. One account we definitely know to be of a Dingonek, since the observer specifically referenced the monster mentioned in Bronson's enclosed territory. The unnamed man recounted when he was exploring around the Mara River. Right where the stream crossed the Anglo-German boundary of the time, he saw the monster floating down the river on a large log. The river was flooding, and the tail of the creature was fully submerged, so he had trouble estimating its size, but it could have been in the ballpark of 16 feet, or a little under 5 meters. What he could clearly discern were the leopard pattern and an otter-like head. He saw no signs of the saber fangs though, which is a crucial difference when identifying the beasts. However, the story is not over. I failed to mention that this person was also a big game hunter. A shot fired, an animal hit. It slid off the log and was never seen again. Unfortunately, I once again have to declare that I fully believe he told the truth. Although, I really hope he also missed, but that was probably not the case. Another story linked to the Dingonek immortalized in this article comes from the District Commissioner of Kisii, one Mr. Crampton, when visiting the Amala River, which is called the Thika River nowadays as far as I know. He spoke with the local Maasai people about a beast called Ol Umaina. Well, the correct spelling would be Ol Maima, but we'll get back to that. Either way, it is a 4.5 meters long monster with a canine head and ears like those of a puff adder. Which, okay, I'm not sure what they meant by that. Olmaima also has short clawed feet and a short neck, spending much of its time sunbathing by the water, slipping beneath the waves when disturbed, swimming with only its head above the water. Oh my, sounds like an actual animal. I wonder what it could be. I'm being facetious of course, I know full well what it is, but I like to keep the suspense for now. Hubley correctly assumed that the Dingonek and Olmaima likely refer to the same or two very similar creatures. He also incorrectly thinks that it is a saurian, a living dinosaur, but there is a reason many folklore monsters or misidentified animals were given the dino label back in the day. Everyone wanted to shoot a gigantic prize-winning prehistoric creature and be immortalized. Emelantoka, Mokolembembe, Kazyrex, the list goes on. As out of those, this one was an incorrect guess too, yet they were very close to debunking the myth themselves. Either way, there was one more monster generally equated with the Dingonek. It is the Ndamathia, a reptilian entity that appears in the Itvika ceremonies of the Kikuyu. Itvika is essentially a passing down of the torch by one generation to the next. The creature lives in the Tana River, which is roughly in the same area, and members of the upcoming generation have to pluck a feather from its tail. Since the Dingonek has no feathers, this may very well be another incorrect assumption. That is the extent of what Hubley managed to dig up on the mysterious being. Even though he found the most important clue, the mystery was unsolved for decades to come, and it is still considered that by some. Chronologically speaking, the next bit of information comes from Jordan again. He recounted his former story in an article that was published in the 39th issue of the Wide World magazine. The year was 1917, and yet the only site I could find that allegedly has a digital copy of it denied me to view it on grounds of copyright. Now, admittedly, I'm not an expert on all things copyright. However, based on a little search, 95 years is the maximum length any work published prior to 1987 can spend under active copyright. So, since 2012, this issue has been enjoying the freedom of public domain. Then why can't I view it? Well, I guess I could buy it for the 2 or so pages that are of interest to me, so it's not technically inaccessible. For only $995, you too can buy a primary source, the contents of which should be publicly available. Well, fortunately, I can simply flip off that price because there was a partial reprint of the very same article in 1918, courtesy of MacLeod's. In it, we carried about more speculations on the Dingonek being a dinosaur or a Mesozoic amphibian. There are also a couple of deviations from Jordan's previous account. For instance, the natives likening the beast to a cross between a snake, a crocodile and a leopard as opposed to one between a sea serpent, a leopard and a whale. But most of these alterations are hardly of note. What is of significance is that the hunter now described the leopard pattern as more of an optical illusion, something caused by the way the light deflected off of the scales. He also changed the leopard head to that of an otter, which is more in line with the unnamed hunter's experience. I'm inclined to believe Jordan made this change because he realized that animal is a more fitting description and not to make his tale more believable. Oh yes, this extra bit of information would have been well worth the $1,000. Regardless, this is the point where first-hand accounts dry up completely. All subsequent books that deal with the Dingonek are based on the information I presented. The creature is a semi-common appearance in cryptozoological works, particularly those that investigate reptiles in hopes of finding dinosaurs or dragons. Most of these offer little more than a summary of the known lore, but Bernard Ouman did quite a bit more work than others. He was Belgian-French, so I'm legally required to use authentic pronunciation. In fact, this beautiful illustration is in his 1985 book titled On the Track of Unknown Animals. It is apparently taken from the Wide World magazine. Take that, you overpriced piece of shit. Beside the picture, Ouman's list of creatures with reptilian features does add one more remarkably similar monster to our collection. It is called the Nsanga and was reported by Lieutenant Paul Grates. The man crossed Africa from the Indian Ocean to the mouth of the Congo with a motorboat and had an interesting story to share from the time he stopped at Lake Benguelu. Apparently, a reptilian creature lived in the local swamps, which the natives feared immensely. He called it a degenerate saurian that differs from crocodiles in 2 aspects. It had no scales, but did have toes armed with claws. Now, crocodiles do have claws themselves, but they can be rather unimpressive at times. Ouman himself wrote that crocodiles have nails instead of claws, which I guess if you cherry-pick some rather dull examples. Either way, The point of this distinction likely means that the Nsanga had much more prominent and vicious claws. Likewise, it may very well have had scales, just not as massive as crocodilians do. More like, say, a monitor. Before we jump to any conclusions, I have to tell that Uvomon did have a bit of a descent into insanity, figuratively speaking of course. He compiled Still Unknown Cats of Africa, which was published posthumously, but contains quite puzzling assumptions and deviations from his previous conclusions. He wrote of how multiple, as yet unknown animals he dealt with in his prime were in fact part of an undiscovered group of aquatic saber-toothed cats that somehow survived extinction and adapted to living in water. Among the reclassified creatures were the Dingonek and the Nsanga. At least that is what I'm led to believe by those who have read it. It is once again a primary source I was unable to locate, plus it was never translated. Apparently, Uvomon made a case for saber-teeth being a great addition to an aquatic predator because walruses have them, kind of missing the two main factors which would completely undermine this point. First off, there aren't many ice flows in Central Africa, and cats have these things called paws, which are far better at pulling them ashore. They could be used in competing for mating rights, I guess, but then again, anything can. Not only are such large felines unlikely to have escaped detection for so long, they are equally prone to have lost their saber teeth anyway, or go extinct as a result of being outcompeted. Not to mention that the animals Uvomon equated with his imaginary cats were all stated to be scaly or smooth-skinned. He did try to headwave this discrepancy with a theory that their wet hair clumped up in the likeness of scales, but that is a rather flimsy attempt. Just look at aquatic mammals with a good bit of hair on them. Does this look scaly to you? The definition of grasping at straws. Either way, we have one more cryptozoological book to mention, even though it will be but a brief section. Said book is the one titled In Search of Prehistoric Survival, Do Giant Extinct Creatures Still Exist? By Carl Schuker. Even though he technically adds nothing to the conversation, he did make one correction that makes all the difference. To my knowledge, he was the first to correctly spell All Umaina as All Maima. If we take a moment to go through the lore of All Maima, we can see that it is a monster of Maasai origin. These people happen to speak a language called Ma, and even though the characters are not a perfect match, we find this word in their dictionary. It means cripple, which is noted by many sources, but they failed to also add this mitre lizard. There's even a Latin name
that we should be capitalized
in this handy online dictionary, which shows it is specifically the Nile monitor, a rather ubiquitous African animal with a leopard-like pattern, a long tail used for swimming, and a relatively large body, although only about half the size mentioned in the accounts. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say? It seems like the Maasai were not talking about a monster, but an actual animal they knew of. Their story is the most grounded too, after all. There are a few inconsistencies with the other ones though. First off, this is not exactly a feline head. Granted, Jordan did later switch to an otter head, which shows a bit more similarity. The armadillo hide is likewise missing, but taking a look at their pattern, mistaking it for armor plates is not that big of a stretch. The missing saber teeth are more of a problem in this regard. Nile monitors do not exactly have the scariest looking fangs. They are pointy, but not prone to fully impaling a human. That being said, this is also one of only mentioned by Jordan, and I do have a theory. Allow me to grasp at straws myself. I propose the forked tongue to be mistaken for canines. We have to keep in mind that the hunter not only saw a rather sizable individual, he misjudged the distance, believing it to be roughly twice the size it actually could have been, which is another factor supporting the idea that he missed the animal with his rifle. It is understandable if he misjudged quite a few of its features too, or possibly added some flair for a better story. What I have no explanation for are the ears though. I mean, there are the openings. It matches paw feathers in that they too have ear openings, albeit much smaller. Leopards also have ear openings, surrounded by their quite unmistakable cat ears. Otters have much smaller ones, but they are still there and visible. So all four animals have notably different ear anatomy. Your guess is as good as mine in this scenario. The last snippet of note is a cave painting found near Brackfontein, of which this is a copy. This shape in particular was proposed by Carl Schuker to be a Dingonek. However, the location is very far from the epicenter of Dingonek sightings and tales, and the only apparent link are the tusks, which are up in the air as to whether they are a consistent feature anyway. It is unlikely to have any connection to the creature we are dealing with. We have more or less covered the full extent of the Dingonek, and you might be wondering about the differences between this image and the first description. The most obvious one being the pangolin scales. This is one of the deviations I actually have an explanation for. Jordan described the height of the creature as that of an armadillo. However, all extant and extinct armadillos are exclusive to the Americas. The next closest thing in terms of an African armored mammal are pangolins with their fused hair plates. This has led many cryptozoologists to consider the beast as some sort of a pangolin, which has subsequently transformed the popular image. It is a more logical assumption, I will grant them that, even if they were a bit off with their theory. The true conundrums are the single horn and the poison stinger. None of these features were ever mentioned in any of the original sightings, and what little snippets we have of the native legends. These seemingly sprouted from nowhere. Even though multiple modern sources add them to the animal, none of them have a reference that mentions those. Well, one of my books might have one, but the entry on the Dingonek is not indexed, so I'd have to go through several dozens of books for a chance to maybe find the origin of these editions. I like doing research, but I'm not insane, so I'll just have to chalk this up as an unknown. Now that we have exhausted the topic of the creature, it's time to move into the murky depths of speculative evolution and craft ourselves a plausible Dingonek. Since some level of challenge is necessary for the end result to be interesting, I'm not just going to copy-paste the Nile monitor. No, I'll try to keep features like the armored back, saber teeth, and possibly the size. We could go a couple ways with this one: alter a monitor, spice up a crocodile, or try Ovomon's aquatic cat. However, I am a pangolin enjoyer. They are one of my two favorite animals, so I'm naturally drawn to making them work, even if it will be a bit harder than with the other options. The largest pangolin to have ever lived is the giant Asian pangolin, clocking in at around 2.5 meters. That is consistent with the Nile monitor, if not the exaggerated sightings. Although, the name of the animal kind of gives it away. This extinct species of armored termite munchers lived in Asia and Java of all places, so a bit far off. Also, it is only about 40,000 years old, so we would be rather limited on possible evolutionary changes too. I simply mention it because it is the favorite proposed Dingonek of most cryptozoologists. I have a different genus in mind, one far more ancient. Eomenis is the earliest known pangolin with actual keratin scales. Scales that do not cover the entirety of the animal like its modern descendants, but only the back of the body and neck. This will be an important feature for us, as you can imagine, but we have a couple different problems. The massive size difference can be chipped away over the next 50 million years, even if pangolin evolution is rather modest. But what about teeth? Pangolins are fully edentulous, missing any semblance of teeth, and instead swallow small stones. These geological dietary supplements are stored in their gizzards and help them grind food to a more easy digestible consistency. Their feeding mechanism is so specialized that they would be hindered by teeth, which puts the saber fangs in an even more awkward position than they already were. Well, we have to go back even further in time. Luckily, there was a study conducted on the dentogenetics of placental mammals that lost their teeth by Robert W. Meredith et al. Kind of spot on for what I need, and the article is also easily accessible. The duality of online information. Apparently, the Eomenis genus had lost the functionality of their enameling gene a couple million years ago, meaning that toothless, or at the very least enamel-less pangolins appeared in the late Paleocene. Well, our oldest pangolin fossils, like those of the Euromenis genus, not only come from the Eocene, but also lack the characteristic scales. This means that any early pangolin we would encounter in the Paleocene would also be naked in this sense. Fortunately, we have a handy thing called convergent evolution, as well as some extra information that may help our case. Based on the stomach contents of Ehlers remains, we do know they also ate plants. Therefore, we can extrapolate that their less specialized ancestors also had a mixed diet. The characteristic tail and clawed hands of pangolins are fine implements whether they wish to dig up a termite nest, maybe roots, or climb trees and consume foliage. Just look at long-tailed pangolins, who are among the more arboreal of the bunch. In our fictional past, one group of Paleocene pangolins did not specialize for ant-licking like their relatives. They maintained a more varied diet and kept their teeth for chewing on plant matter and crunchier arthropods without the use of stones. However, convergent evolution sent them down a similar path in terms of their sharp scales, a powerful line of defense against predators, and a simple modification of their fur. They do not appear on the whole body of our ancient Dingoneks though, much like for Ehlers, as they transition to a different lifestyle in the upcoming millennia. They become semi-aquatic. While they forage most of their food still on land, water gives them an extra layer of defense. They slip into the nearby lake or river when threatened, using their powerful prehensile tail to augment their swimming capabilities. Since they are not covered in scales head to toe, their tail has a wider range of motion, swishing from side to side to generate speed. The feet also adapt to this dual use. No longer are they fine-tuned for digging. While the powerful claws are still there, aiding in foraging and climbing, the fingers are set further apart with some modest webbing between them. Having access to a new type of habitat, these claws are also rather useful for forcing open or cracking the shells of mollusks. Like many other pangolin species belonging to the Phyllodontomorpha clade, early Dingoneks also grow larger. They have quite a wide range of food sources, making them more adaptable and resilient to environmental changes. With this safety net, they eventually reach 2.5 meters of length, with some individuals closing in on 3 meters. Their hard scales give them a fair bit of protection from many of the African predators. Lions, hyenas, crocodiles are often hindered by the cutting edge of this protective layer. Losing it would surely be a disadvantage, just like it extending to cover the entire body would be. Another peculiar element of their evolution entails their canines. While they originally served to puncture the hard shells of some nuts and mollusks, they became symbols of great genetics. Yes, I'm going the reproduction route with the saber tusks. There is no other way it would make any sense for this creature. Male Dingoneks have enlarged canines that protrude from their jaws. Their mostly peaceful use consists of showing off these dental ornaments while standing on their hind legs. If there is no clear winner, a bit of wrestling and claw-based combat determines the one more fit to sire offspring. Tusks used for such purposes are not exactly rare in the animal kingdom. Plus we have musk and water as testaments that somewhat enlarged canines are enough for these sorts of manly competitions. That being said, these fangs are a bit different from those of our ruminant examples. They are firmly locked in place. These teeth are not too disruptive when it comes to eating. Dingonek jaws are rather different from deer ones, and we are still dealing with a restricted space of a pangolin skull. Granted, they deviate quite a bit from their toothless relatives, the evolution of such a space-demanding adaptation for essentially no reason is an unlikely occurrence. On a related note, the reason most accounts did not speak of these tusks is purely coincidental. Male Dingoneks only sprout these saber teeth before the mating season, and shed them shortly afterwards. Therefore, the ones seen by everyone except Jordan were either female or males who have already shed theirs. Pangolins do have their unique ears, ones that would not change too much for this animal either. Having conflicting reports of these appendages, it is safe to assume that we do not break the lore too much with these. As for the leopard pattern, the short fur covering most of their body would not suffer any disadvantage due to a more concealing style. Additionally, I do not see why a slightly toned-down version of that would not be possible for pangolin scales either. Jordan even claimed that it seemed like an optical illusion more than an actual leopard paint job. What I have in mind is reminiscent of long-tailed pangolins. They are kind of the only extant species that have a pattern on their scales. They are dark at the base and become almost yellowish towards the edge. Flipping the two hues would almost imitate the spotted hide of a leopard. If we pair it with the Dingonek's fur pattern elsewhere, it would be easy to assume it continues on the scales as well. This certainly helps their concealment in foliage, so I can definitely see it as a viable adaptation. These are the originally reported features or implemented for our realistic version. I'm a bit surprised. There are few episodes where I can go without describing numerous notable characteristics as embellishments. Well, there is the size, but that is a simple exaggeration. Often having no point of reference, it is easy to misjudge how big a thing floating or swimming in the water is. For rather obvious reasons, I did not include the unicorn horn and the venomous stinger. Not only are these inauthentic additions, but rather implausible ones at that. A large mammal would have little use for a scorpion-like weapon, even if venom is not that far-fetched. The unicorn is an even less likely thing, a superfluous display piece at best, an ironically pointless armament at worst. So, here it is. A Dingonek that could potentially exist in an alternate reality. Well, our Earth technically already has a Dingonek, but this is a more lawful variant. I've got to say, having both of my favorite animals in a single video, them being monitor lizards and pangolins, is a rare treat for sure. I'm quite happy with how this turned out too. Definitely one of the more obscure creatures I've ever covered, and also one of the few clear-cut cases for identification, even if cryptozoologists did not get the memo. This is it for the video though. Thank you for watching the video. If you like this topic, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where we commonly discuss speculative evolution. There's also a channel Patreon if you'd like to support this form of content. All relevant links are in the description. I hope you enjoyed the past half an hour. I thought this was going to be a short one. Anyway, hope to see you next time. Bye!